of its School of Business. We stole her, poached her, attracted her from Salem State University in Massachusetts, where she had served as dean for 10 years, which is a very long time for a dean, so you must have been doing a wonderful job. Prior to Salem State, she served as a founding dean of the School of Business and Information Science at LaSalle College. Dean Doran has been a businesswoman. She's a commercial pilot. She just said she prefers to fly the planes than jump out of them. She's been a consultant. She's very well situated to be our new dean. So welcome, Dean Brewer, to bring a greeting to you.
Thank you, Faith. I am delighted to be here. As you all know, I'm brand new to Concordia. I've been here less than a month. But I'm really thrilled to be here. And I've been amazed at the warmth of the welcome from both the Concordia community and the surrounding community. Concordia is such a special place, and I was deeply attracted by its mission, which I think is really relevant here, to influence the affairs of the world by sending into society thoughtful and informed men and women dedicated to the Christian life. That was cemented for me by the dedication of the campus to BREW, which stands for our core curriculum and becoming responsibly engaged in the world. It also happens to be the name my family call me, and it accurately portrays my beliefs as a business dean. As a long-term business dean, I'm determined to instill in our students an understanding that business is not just about making money, but much more. Since this is a luncheon about faith and work, that's where my own faith comes in. I believe deeply that it's my responsibility to build a future generation of ethical business leaders who think about a great deal more than simply their own needs and wealth. In fact, there's a great deal of research that while you might make a lot of money in the short term by behaving in a less than ethical fashion, those companies that conduct themselves in an ethical, caring way share much higher returns in the long run. The American Accounting Association has been leading the way in this area by developing a concept called the triple bottom line, which looks at not only the actual or dollar bottom line, but also at social responsibility or ethics and sustainability as two additional but equally important metrics for today's businesses that go way beyond the money. I believe that Concordia's mission and BREW mindset can help us lead the way in educating business leaders of the future. We're about to be treated to a truly wonderful visit from our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, who will reflect on the events of 9/11. For me, living in Boston at the time, where two of the planes had originated, and growing up just outside New York City, watching the towers be built from our attic window, it's particularly poignant for me. You asked where I was, where we all were. I was working in my office and received a phone call from a former student in Hong Kong saying, "Turn on the TV." My entire building, I had the only TV in the room or in the building because I used it for keying up videos to teach with. My entire building came down and we watched the events of that morning as we called our students back from side trips to Boston when we found out that two of the planes had originated from there. I knew people who were lost that day. And since today is the actual anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, I'd like to honor those we lost with a moment of silence. Thank you. And now, on to the show.
To bring the president to life, welcome Joe Wigand. Joe Wiegand is regarded as the nation's premier repriser of Theodore Roosevelt. At the pinnacle of a 25-year career in politics and public policy in his native Illinois, Joe began performing as Theodore Roosevelt in 2004. In 2008, after serving as campaign manager for gubernatorial and presidential campaigns in the land of Lincoln, Joe set out with his wife Jenny, daughter Sam, and golden retriever Faith on a 50-state tour celebrating Tears' 6th century birthday and the centennial of Tears' final year in office. The trip was highlighted by a performance at the White House for President and Mrs. George W. Bush on Theodore Roosevelt's 150th birthday. So Joe is a political science graduate of Sewanee, the University of the South in Tennessee, and a former graduate assistant at the Center for Governmental Studies at Northern Illinois University. Joe is a Harry S. Truman Scholar and a Thomas J. Watson Fellow. He's a member of Encinitas,
right, well done.
California Rotary Club, and a member of the National Association for Interpretation. A former county commissioner in DeKalb County, Illinois, Joe and his wife now reside in sunny San Diego. So let's welcome Joe Wiegand as President Theodore Roosevelt.
Wonderful, now. Thank you kindly. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not quite sure who that Joe Wiegand fellow is, but he sounds like he's all right. I am Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm delighted to be with you. I start with acknowledgement of the wonderful words with which the program began this morning. Professor Njuri, Professor Johnson, thank you for those words, so appropriate as we saw the images of September 11th, 2001 on the screen. Thank you as well, Dean Brewer-Doran, for the moment of silence. I'm sure each of us went to a special place of prayer during that moment of silence. But let us bookend that moment of silence. Let us perhaps echo the words of the members of Congress, the members of the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, who I believe on that very day, as they themselves were lost in reflection, I think, at the terrible events of the day, they gathered on the steps of our Capitol building, and they sang out a song composed by Irving Berlin when we were in the midst of the terrible war that we thought might end all wars, World War I. 1918 was the year that Irving Berlin wrote, "God Bless America." Would you all rise and join me in that national prayer that we all know? Now, Governor Schaefer, chairman of the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, also is very familiar with the Medora musical. I'm not in the musical. The producers have seen me dance and heard me sing. But when we join our voices together, we all sound, I think, good for the moment. Would you all join together in God Bless America, land that I love, stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Bully. Thank you all so very much. Wasn't that a delightful, delightful song? Well, I wanted to share with you a bit of my own history and faith. Governor Schaefer and I were discussing earlier perhaps a misunderstanding about me historically. I was a man of deep and abiding faith, in great part because I grew up in a household that had a deep and abiding faith. The greatest man I ever knew, and the man for whom I named Theodore Roosevelt, Well, in our family, we called him Greatheart. Does anyone anymore read Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress? Greatheart, who leads Christian and the other pilgrims on to celestial salvation, past places like Vanity Fair, the place for which the magazine is named, past the Slough of Despond, past the place where the men with the muck rakes in their hands rake the muck and mire of human existence, failing to look up and see that celestial salvation is right before them. Hence my phrase, the muck-raking press. It was not a compliment that I paid to the yellow journalists of the day. Now, my father lived the gospel. He was a founding member of the Children's Home and Aid Society in New York City, an organization that saw successfully the adoption of thousands of New York City orphans by Midwest and Western farm families, a founder of the Children's Orthopedic Hospital, and on Sunday afternoons, as a founder and member of the a supporter of the newspaper boys' lodging house, the Newsies, the orphan boys that sold newspapers on the filthy streets of New York, morning, noon, and night for a penny apiece. Because of the efforts of my father and other gentlemen, at night they had a warm and safe place to sleep, a good meal, and on Sundays, Bible study taught by my father. Teaching Bible study was an important thing in our family. My grandfather, James Dunwoody Bullock, taught Sunday school at the First Presbyterian Church in Roswell, Georgia, and indeed died suddenly while teaching Sunday school there one day. That belies the fact, then, that I am before you not only a New Yorker, but half Georgian, half Southerner. My parents were married in Roswell, Georgia in 1853. Now, my mother, after the Civil War, well, she remained entirely unreconstructed for decades. But later in my life, I visited Roswell, and I had the pleasure of visiting a Mrs. Baker, a lady who in her youth had been Miss King, the last surviving member of my parents' bridal party. 2 decades later, Mrs. King was still, or Mrs. Baker, the former Miss King, was still alive. A newspaper woman from Atlanta, Georgia, went to Roswell and interviewed Mrs. Baker about that 1853 wedding and wrote the story up in the Atlanta newspaper. She wrote the story as Peggy Mitchell. 2 years later, Peggy Mitchell published Gone with the Wind as Margaret Mitchell. And there are some who say that Scarlett O'Hara is based in part on my mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt. My mother was not a deeply religious nor a faithful person, but she was a vivacious person. She loved life, entertaining at parties and telling stories of my Southern heritage. And there are some historians who say I would have never been president but for these stories of daring do and adventure amongst my Southern relatives. Stories of hunting panther in the swamp, marching off to fight in the Seminole War in Florida, or crossing the Savannah River to fight duels on points of honor to the death. But it was my father that had the great faith, and my father who said that we could show our love for one another in the family not simply by speaking, but by doing good deeds, by learning Bible verses and sharing our knowledge of those Bible verses when the family gathered. My father taught us children to be honest and courageous, to stand up and fight for the right as we saw the right, and against the wrong, especially the bullying of the weak and the poor. My father saw to it that I took the entrance examination for my own college education at Harvard College, today Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And you good common sense people of the Midwest must understand me when I tell you, I didn't learn much of practical value at Harvard. Most of my classmates majored in the issue of nightlife across the Charles River in Boston. But my own father had sent me from New York to Cambridge my freshman year with these words. He said, Theodore, first, take care of your morals. Second, your health. And third, your studies. My father was the only man of whom I was ever really afraid, but in a good sense of the word. I never wanted to disappoint my father. It's hard for me to put to words what a terrible blow it was to me my sophomore year at Harvard when my father died, quickly and suddenly, of stomach cancer. He, but a young man of 45, The entire city of New York was in mourning, and I was in a terribly foul mood. My tutor, Arthur Cutler, knew that in the past being outdoors and having strenuous exercise had not only restored my health, overcome my asthma, but had restored my spirits, and so he sent me to the north woods of Maine, to the great Aroostook country, along the Penobscot River. And there, with a hunting guide named William Sewell and his nephew Wilmot Dow, two men who short years later would join me in ranching along the Little Missouri. In Maine, we hunted and hiked and canoed. We climbed Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, famous today as the northern terminus of the Great Appalachian Trail. We visited the lumber camps, where my vocabulary was greatly expanded. And each and every morning before we had our adventures, I would take my own canoe to a place south of Island Falls, Maine, where the west branch of Lake Metanumkeg River is joined by First Brook. And there, in the early morning lights, by the sound of those waters joining gently, I began each and every day, as my late father would have me do, with Bible devotion. In the years hence, the people of the state of Maine have seen fit to name that little point of land a state historic site called Bible Point, so named for the fact that I, as a young man, sought and found the wisdom and comfort and solace of the good book there. I came to the Badlands in 1883 to hunt a bison bull, but it was not my first visit to North Dakota. I know sometimes that's what we tell the school children, but to really know my history, I first came to Dakota Territory in 1880. Between my graduation and my marriage that fall, my brother Elliot and I came out hunting in Iowa, Minnesota, and Dakota Territories. The game had been mostly hunted out. The hunt didn't account for much. But the people were quite interesting, as they still are this day. When I returned from my bison hunt, well, before I returned, I invested in the cattle ranch, purchased 450 head of cattle, and had Sylvain Ferris and William Merrifield run my Chimney Butte or Maltese Cross Ranch. I returned to New York City. I'd been elected to my third one-year term to the New York General Assembly. Oh, can you imagine me in the General Assembly as its youngest member? The cartoonists had a great deal of fun at my expense. But I was the man with the sun in his face. Happy indeed in great part because life offers no greater reward than working hard at work worth doing. And happier still for the fact that my wife Alice and I were expecting our first child. And happy was the day when the telegram came to the floor in Albany announcing that Alice and I were the parents of a healthy baby girl. Congratulations were all about. Even my political opponents were happy for me. But then a second and most ominous telegram came. That telegram sent me for the train, on the train down the Hudson Valley, racing to my family home in the middle of the night, where my brother Elliot answered the door with these words. He said, "There is a curse upon this house. Mother is dying, and your wife is too." On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, 1884, when I was 25, my dear sweet widowed mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, the Rose of Roswell, Georgia, she died of typhoid fever. And that afternoon, beneath the same roof and in my arms, my dear sweet bride Alice, she but 22 and a new mother, she died of Bright's disease, a kidney disease now quite treatable by modern medicine. There's nothing in my diary that day but a large black X, where I later wrote that the light had gone out of my life. I thought forever. A friend wrote of the funeral 2 days later, "Theodore knows neither what he does nor says." But I was a man of faith. And my faith told me my loved ones were not gone, but gone before. And I took courage from the words of my late father, who said, "Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action." And indeed, a great part of the action that I undertook was to come here, to return to the Dakota Territory, to establish my second ranching operation, the Elkhorn Ranch, 30 miles north of Medora and downstream on the Little Missouri. Sewell and Dow came out with me to operate that ranch. And being in the great outdoors, in God's creation, in the hard work of ranching, well, even my great sadness healed. But I always had with me that great book of comfort and wisdom, That book that had given me solace in the north woods of Maine gave me great solace in the Badlands of Dakota Territory. I said later in my life that a thorough knowledge of the Bible was worth more than a college education. Well, I had my critics on this point, of course. One man said, now, President Roosevelt, don't you realize that without an education, a man might steal from a railroad car? I said, sir, that's true. But history has shown that with the wrong sort of education, a man might steal an entire railroad. Well, here at Concordia College, you're getting about the work of the right sort of education. An education whose cornerstone is faith and the tenets of our faith. There's bright days ahead for Concordia College. And there's bright days ahead for our country, despite the attacks that we've suffered and continue to suffer, not only abroad, but continuingly here, domestically. I was witness to some of these sorts of attacks during my own lifetime. Amongst my earliest memories, when I was a small boy, not yet 7, I remember watching the sad funeral parade of President Lincoln as the martyred remains of the great emancipator came through New York City on their way back to his native Springfield. As a young man, I knew the story of the assassination of President Garfield, the establishment of the United States Civil Service Commission, and the Pendleton Act resulting, a position that I myself was appointed to by President Benjamin Harrison, and that I served at the time that Concordia College was founded along the banks of the Red River. It was also, of course, the sad assassination of President McKinley in September of 1901. Nearly 100 years to the day. The 11th was in between the days when he was shot and the day he died. President McKinley was in Buffalo that September 6th of 1901. I'd been traveling in the West. On September 1st, I'd been at the State Fair here in Minnesota, in St. Paul, where for the first time in my life I quoted the old African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." I'd traveled on to Vermont. I was at Isle La Motte in Lake Champlain. The north end of that island has a great Catholic shrine. The south end of the island, there's a farm and a granite quarry. Lieutenant Governor Fisk, the Republican of Vermont, was the owner, and he was hosting 600 men and women, members of the Vermont Fish and Game Association, that September 6th. He had the only telephone on the island, and that telephone ominously rang with the sad news from Buffalo. President McKinley had been greeting visitors at the Temple of Music during the World's Exposition there, and there was one man who, in the reception line, appeared to have a bandage on his right hand. And when President McKinley extended the hand of friendship and peace to Leon Schoellgolz, not only an anarchist, but an atheist, when McKinley extended his hand, Schoellgolz shot the president twice in the abdomen with a gun that had been concealed in his fake bandage. Well, getting the news at Isle La Motte, I raced by steamboat to Burlington and then by train to Buffalo. And after some days, the physicians assured me and the members of the cabinet that President McKinley would recuperate from his wounds. They felt that it would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if I was seen to go on a planned vacation with my family in my beloved Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. I remember it well. Ted Jr. shot his first buck. My little bunnies played in the headwaters of the Hudson River. The entire family went and camped at Lake Colden. And after a rainstorm, the family returned to the Tahoe Hunting Club. While I went with an old man from Quebec, Noah Lacoste, we climbed Mount Marcy, the highest mountain in New York State. The mountain is known by the locals as the Cloud Splitter. And the mountain lived up to its reputation. Just as we ascended through the clouds to the top of the mountain, the clouds all dissipated. And Noah Lacoste pointed out all of the landmarks and lakes down below. We came down and had lunch at Lake Tier of the Clouds, the source waters themselves for the Hudson. Lunch of ox tongue out of a can. You've got a much better luncheon here, I can assure you. I saw a hunting guide, Harrison Hall, running through the woods with a piece of paper. I knew it to be bad news. It was from Buffalo. The president was thought to be dying. I was needed in Buffalo. Unfortunately for President McKinley, the two physicians treating his wounds were both obstetricians, neither of whom had ever treated a gunshot wound in their practice. I raced down Mount Marcy in the rain, changing horses on my buckboard twice. Imagine the muddy, corduroyed roads, myself holding a lantern before the carriage. We made that trip faster down Mount Marcy in the rain and the dark than any sportsman was able to do in the daylight and dry conditions, trying to best our time. When we arrived at North Creek and the depot there at 6 o'clock in the morning, I was handed another telegram. This from Secretary of State John Hay, he who in his youth had been Lincoln's private secretary. And that telegram stated that at 2:15 that morning, while I was en route down the mountain, President McKinley had died. I was now your 26th president. I raced by train to Buffalo, paid condolences to Mrs. McKinley, and then in a private residence, in a borrowed suit, without a Bible at hand, I took the oath of office, stating briefly beforehand that it would be my aim that the policies of the McKinley administration for the peace, prosperity, and honor of the American people would remain entirely unbroken. As the funeral train made its way to Washington, D.C., I had written a friend a letter that while the nation was in a period of mourning, we must not be morbid about the duties before us. Fast forwarding to September 11th, 2001, did we not take comfort when the firefighters rose the American flag above those terrible reminders of the destruction so recent? And did we not even take greater comfort from the great mystery of the cross fashioned by the steel beams amongst the ruins? We suffered terribly as a people on September 11th, 2001, and we gather today in great part to remember the victims of that tragedy, and the men and the women of our first responders and the armed forces that continue to respond each and every day on our behalf, not only to that attack, but to the conditions that beset us today. But I ask some of you here, some of you of a generation that might remember a similar attack, December 7th, 1941, some of you grew up remembering and commemorating the attack and the loss, a cowardly attack, Pearl Harbor Day. And I challenge us as a nation, as a university community. You have some of the best and brightest students of the country here on your campus. But I ask you, I was president of the American Historical Association myself for a term. I'm curious. Were you to approach each and every one of your young carbers, were you simply to ask them, what is the historical significance of December 7th, 1941? Would we get a passing grade? Would your young students, 18 through 22, would they be able to say Pearl Harbor? And amongst those that could say Pearl Harbor, how many could put that phrase into its proper and accurate historical context? I'm afraid the number would be lower than we might hope. I hope that, in part, what we resolve to do each September 11th is to make sure that this date shall never be forgotten, that in making sure that this date is not forgotten, to redouble our efforts, that the other dates, the other sacrifices made, that we might live as a free people, that they might be remembered as well. I shared with your friends and colleagues in Bismarck the other day that we've read the news recently. President Obama, by executive order, has renamed Mount McKinley, perhaps the greatest memorial to our martyred president, the last president to have fought in the Civil War, he serving at Antietam and in Shenandoah Valley. Well, now we're officially to call the mountain Denali. Apparently, some of the native peoples had referred to the mountain by that name in previous generations and continue to do so. That's all well and good. Many of our mountains have multiple names. Do you know that Mount Rainier itself is named for a Canadian who was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War? But now to the point of Mount McKinley. I've had several adults approach me as a result of those remarks, stating that they did not realize that they didn't remember that President McKinley had been assassinated, that I'd come to the presidency through the graveyard, that I was an accidental president. Well, do you think that the changing of the name of Mount McKinley to Denali will do anything to further the memory of President McKinley and his service to our people, of his martyrdom to the cause of freedom and prosperity of our people? I think not. Not all change is progress. Well, not to be dour, I don't think any man ever enjoyed himself in doing the duties of the presidency in the White House as much as I did, nor that any family enjoyed themselves more than the Roosevelt family. To you and to the American people, I owe a debt of gratitude for the experiences that I had in leading the nation. And I was a man of faith as your president. I was in the White House and doing a bit of moralizing. One senator bristled at my sermonizing. He said, "Mr. President, you're preaching." I said, "Senator, you're right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit, too." Now, the bully pulpit is a very nice golf course nearby Medora, North Dakota. Testimony again to the fact that time and history have marched on. But I hope that you will remember that I not only taught Sunday school at Harvard, at the Episcopal Church. A new rector came to the Episcopal Church at Harvard and said that I could no longer teach Sunday school unless I converted from my own Dutch Reformed faith to the Episcopal Church. I did not make the switch, and we're going to make a reconciliation. I'm going to teach Sunday school again at the Harvard Episcopal Church in one of the months ahead. I taught Sunday school when I returned from Europe aboard the steamship that crossed the Atlantic. I don't know that anyone's ever really told the story of how important I did believe a deep and abiding faith, a knowledge of the Bible was to our people. But not just a knowledge of the Bible. In 1905, I took the oath of office in my own right. I'd been elected the previous November by the largest electoral vote and popular vote plurality in our history. And at that inauguration in 1905 in Washington, D.C., I wore my own suit. And I had the Roosevelt family Bible at hand. On my right hand was a locket ring, given to me by John Hay. That locket ring contained a clipping of Abraham Lincoln's hair, taken from his deathbed. And with that right hand held aloft, my left hand was upon James 1:21 and 22. Be thou not only hearers of the word, but doers of the word also. The verses go on to admonish that doing the word means caring for the sick, the widow, and the orphan, those imprisoned, doing the gospel. I can hear those words echoed in the words my father instructed me as a young boy. I shared that Irving Berlin gave us God Bless America, 1918, that terrible war. You know, my friends in Congress passed a resolution stating that I should be allowed to lead a division of cavalry across the fields of France and into the German machine guns. Perhaps those weren't my friends in Congress that passed that resolution. I went to the White House seeking my commission from President Wilson. He looked at me and through me and said, "President Roosevelt, we now have professional soldiers to do that sort of thing." My son Quentin, the youngest boy, said, "It is rather up to us to do what Father preaches." All four of my boys went and fought in Europe. My son Kermit joining the British forces to get into the war early, fighting in Mesopotamia. Now my daughter Ethel, she went to Paris with the Red Cross, as did my daughter-in-law Eleanor, Ted Jr.'s wife, before Congress passed a law that prohibited wives of soldiers from going to the front lines as nurses. I traveled the country calling for preparedness, unity, selling war bonds with my daughter Alice. Christian businessmen came to me asking if I might write an introduction for a Bible that was being given, a New Testament being given to all of the Christian soldiers that desired one. The Bible was bound in a metal cover for the fact that it would protect the pages of the Bible from the terrible conditions to be found in the trenches of Europe. the soldiers would wear that Bible over their breast as an additional hope against the German bullets. I wrote that introduction, and I'd like to share the words contained in that frontispiece with you here today. And pardon me for my vision is 156, nearly 157 years old. The teaching of the New Testament is foreshadowed in Micah's verse. What more doth the Lord require of thee than to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? Do justice, and therefore fight valiantly against those that stand for the reign of Moloch and Beelzebub on this earth. Love mercy. Treat your enemies well. Succor the afflicted. Treat every woman as if she were your sister. Care for the little children, and be tender with the old and helpless. Walk humbly. You will do so if you study the life and teachings of the Savior, walking in his steps. And remember, the most perfect machinery of government will not keep us as a nation from destruction if there is not within us a soul. No abounding of material prosperity shall avail us if our own spiritual senses atrophy. The foes of our own household will surely prevail against us unless there be in our people an inner life which gives its outward expression in a morality like unto that preached by the seers and prophets of God, when the grandeur that was Greece and the glory that was Rome still lay in the future. You may know that my son Quentin gave his life over the Battle of the Marne as an Army Air Corpsman, July 1918. He was buried where he fell, received a funeral with military honors by the Germans, and when the Allies won the ground, the propeller of his plane forming a cross above his grave became a point of pilgrimage for Allied soldiers headed to the front. Rather than bring his remains back to the United States, I said, where a mighty oak falls, there let it lay. I did not want a space for transport taken up by Quentin to delay any soldier from returning home. You may know that that war did not, of course, end all wars. We fought a terrible World War II to follow. All three of my surviving boys entered that war. Ted Jr. was the only general to go to shore on D-Day, leading troops at Utah Beach with nothing but his cane. A month later, after spending the evening visiting with his son Quentin, his late brother's namesake, Ted Jr. died of a heart attack. After the war, he was buried at Normandy, and his brother's remains brought down to lie by his side. Quentin, the only World War I casualty, buried at Normandy. We've all known loss. We've all known tragedy. Those closest to the victims of September 11, 2001, know it perhaps more starkly and remember it more deeply today than many of us. As a nation, we mourn, but we must not be morbid about the duties before us. After my presidency, I hunted in Africa. I toured Europe. I accepted my Nobel Peace Prize, given to me and the American people for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I also spoke at the great universities of Europe. And in April 1910 at the Sorbonne, I made a speech which is amongst the most famous of my utterances. The speech is called Citizenship in a Republic. And Professor Njuri is very delighted to know that I shall not recite the speech in its entirety this afternoon. It is a small portion of that speech which remains famous today. And I share these words of encouragement with you, good people of Concordia College and of the Red River Valley. For again, indeed, into each and every one of our lives there will be hardship and tragedy and defeat. And you're about doing good deeds, doing the good deeds of the gospel. But this is America. No good deed goes unpunished. Certainly no good deed goes without its second-guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Persist in your good deeds. The Republic needs them now more than ever. And when you are criticized, take heart from and remember the words that I shared with the French a century ago and with you here in Moorhead today. Remember, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends himself in a worthy cause, and who, in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if she fails, at least she fails while daring greatly, that her name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Good citizens, we've all known victory, we've all known defeat. We're all human, we all prefer the former over the latter. But I share stories throughout the country on behalf of the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation and the people of North Dakota, stories of my overcoming asthma as a boy, of overcoming the tragedies of loss that I shared with you today, to give encouragement. For indeed, you know, life knocks you down. Your duty to yourselves, your families, to this college, indeed to the Republic, is that when life does knock you down, you're to get back up again, dust yourself off, and get back into the fight for life. But there I am preaching from the bully pulpit again. I'm so very delighted that you're here today in support of the Offutt School of Business and the Lorentzen luncheons. I know that Professor Njuri will give thanks to our sponsors. I give thanks to the Offutt's family and to the Lorentzen family, to those that understand that we each and every one of us have the responsibility, perhaps best summed up in the phrase of the Scouts, to leave our campground cleaner than we found it. I ask a personal favor of each and every one of you as well. Take your children, take your grandchildren out into the wild places of this country. I healed in the Badlands of Dakota Territory. Some of you know there's nothing so good for the inside of a man or a woman as the outside of a horse. And riding my horse Manitou across those buttes and through those coulees, hunting and ranching. Well, take your children and grandchildren out into those wild places, and I'll strongly suggest Theodore Roosevelt National Park to be amongst them. Let them camp beneath the stars and wake to the smell of wood smoke. And most importantly, let them do a bit of risking. Let them swim that river, climb that tree, climb that butte, and yes, fall down and scrape themselves up a bit. Why? So that they can rub away the pain and get back into the game, and thus show themselves that they've got the right stuff in themselves. I'm greatly concerned. An author, Richard Loeb, has written a book, The Last Child in the Woods. He and sociologists have identified a condition amongst our youth called outdoor deficit disorder. And it is a laughable and lamentable situation. There are children who are so bound to their electronics indoors that they are actually afraid of the outdoors, afraid to venture in the woods, of a mind that they don't want to go down to the lake shore and the creek side that for us was such a great mentor and teacher in our own youth. So do the nation a favor. Take your children out into its wild and quiet places. Tell them stories of the heritage and history of this country, and share with them the wonderful wisdom and comfort of that book which is above all other written literature, the wonderful Bible that tells the story of our great salvation through grace. Godspeed, the Carvers of Concordia College, and 3 cheers for Concordia. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Isn't that bully fun? I think we should end every lecture that way. Now, I was the first president to make permanent office space available at the White House for members of the press, something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret. But I think if I have allowed some time, Professor Njuri, just a moment or two, if there's any question or comment that anyone has about my faith life, about my time ranching, about my own time as a college student. Anything at all, anything would be appropriate. Anyone? Would anyone like to box or wrestle? My friend Van Larson might like to do so, right? You all ready for a box or a wrestle? Is it a question or a comment, Mr. Larson?
I was curious, you were a faith member, but how did your friends in college perceive that, and what did they do with you in there, if anything?
I'll repeat a bit of Mr. Larson's question or comment about my college years and my faith, and how did the fellow students regard me and my exercise of faith. Of course, I had some friends in faith, but the majority of students there, of course, Harvard at the time, numbering several hundred students attending Harvard at the time, many of them Boston Brahmins, most of them lacking intellectual curiosity, enjoying more the spirits to be found in the taverns across the Charles River or in the drinking societies. And I must admit, Mr. Larson, I myself stumbled a bit at college. I was a member of the Porcellian. One night I drank entirely too much red wine at one of the events. I wrote my sister that when I returned to my quarters, I barely had enough sense to wind my watch. When I woke the next morning, I promised myself I would never feel that way again, a promise I kept to myself. Now, I had friends in faith, and let me share with you one, my dear friend Henry. Henry and I spent much of our summers, freshman and sophomore summers, out paddling through the Adirondacks, up around Tupper Lake. We wound up the third year writing a pamphlet. Many that know my story of my life know that my first book was something I began writing at Harvard, a history of the Naval War of 1812. The first few chapters of that book read as dryly as a dictionary. I wrote 30 books. I didn't write well, I simply took well to writing. But before I published that book, Henry and I published that pamphlet on the birds of Franklin County, New York, their habitats and their behaviors, observed by us as we paddled about the lakes and camped there. Henry's father withdrew him from school after his sophomore year. He said that Harvard was ruining Henry's morals. Perhaps more parents should be withdrawing their students from Harvard, but I'll leave that to the parents. A little bit of fun there. Henry became a vice president of the Great Northern Railroad. He was younger and better educated than some of the other old, crusty vice presidents. When the Great Northern came to the Mouse River in Dakota, there was no one living nearby, no one ranching nearby, after whom you would normally name the station. The other vice presidents thought that they would indeed have some fun with young Henry and name the station after him, after my friend, Henry Minot. How about that? There's a little North Dakota history for the people of North Dakota. Iron sharpens iron, right? I found those friends at Harvard that sharpened me, that kept me accountable in my faith, and I keeping them accountable in theirs. There was much to lure a young man out of his faith to do things which he might regret for a short time or for the rest of his life. And that was that a circle of friends like Henry, that we kept each other on the straight and narrow path as fellow collegians, as members of the Crimson at Harvard. Mr. Larson, may I share a bit about the Sunshine Memorial Foundation? 12 hours ago, 13 hours ago, I was standing on Pier 40 in San Francisco, celebrating a great film that will be in the IMAX theaters, The National Parks Adventures, due in theaters in the spring. I enjoyed myself greatly amongst those folks celebrating the national parks. Perhaps considered my greatest legacy for the American people, that erroneously so. Our first national park was Yellowstone under President Grant in 1872. The National Park Service itself, we celebrate the centennial next year. Actually something that President Woodrow Wilson got right. Now, just days ago, if not a day ago, my friends Van and Dee Larson, they were in Phoenix, Arizona, remembering a loss that they suffered. Their dear daughter, known as Sunshine in the family, She died as a result of dehydration and heat prostration, hiking in the mountains of Phoenix. I'm sure there was a great deal of mourning, a great deal of sadness that still stays with the family today. But the Larsens have taken that tragedy and turned it around to make life better for others. The Sunshine Memorial Foundation throughout the nation teaches people about proper hydration before they do their outdoor activities. And the Sunshine Memorial Foundation is about building a guest house in Grand Forks, in the region there, if I've got it right, for anyone who might be using the medical facilities of that community. They've taken tragedy, and they've found what little good and built upon it that they can, leaving their campground cleaner than they found it and doing great honor to the memory of their late daughter. You do what we must all do. Take a tragedy like September 11th, 2001. Find what little glimmer of hope we might find in that tragedy. We see through the glass darkly, but we are a people of faith, and we know that Providence is with us, and He has a plan for us. And we'll execute that plan if we humble ourselves individually and as a nation in prayer and ask for the guidance of the Almighty in what we might do next, both to fight the evil that is amongst us and to propagate the good that is so much more bountiful, in great part for the work being done here at Concordia College. Bully. Bully. I think we'll leave it there. Now, Faith, if you would, bring up my little friend. I've got to admit, I suffered if there's a sportsman in the audience, you can understand what a tragedy it would be to go on a bear hunt and to be presented with a wounded and tied bear and be told by one of your hunting hosts to go ahead and shoot that wounded and tied bear. Well, as a result of that terrible, terrible hunting trip, we gave birth to Teddy's bear. Mrs. Michtam, seeing a cartoon of the incident, she wrote me at the White House asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back, I said, you may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all. I wonder if any of you have known the love and comfort of what then was called Teddy's bear? Do any of you still have your teddy bear? Up with your hands if you have a teddy bear. I see some of you ladies have married your teddy bears, haven't you? The toy manufacturers, enthused by the profits that came to their bottom line from Teddy's bear, they thought that they might continue in their profits if they made a stuffed animal in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But I'm afraid for the toy manufacturers, and in honor of William Howard Taft, American mothers never really took kindly to the idea of putting Billy the Possum in with the children at night. The teddy bear reigned supreme. When we were in Bismarck, Professor Nunjuri had her beautiful daughter, Amari, with her, and Amari was given a Medora National Park Centennial teddy bear. But I've become rather fond of the lady that we've stolen from Massachusetts. Dean Brewer Doran, would you please come here and would you accept, on behalf of Governor Schaefer and myself and the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, and do come and visit us in the Badlands. This teddy bear, I hope it will be a mascot for you and give you blessings in the days ahead. Godspeed. Thank you so very, very much. Bully. And now, my friend, Professor Nunjuri, please. Delightful. You don't need this one, do you? Bully.
As President Roosevelt said, I was going to thank our sponsors for today. So I want to thank 3 families who are seated here who helped to offset the bill of bringing Theodore Roosevelt to life for us this week as we remember the events of 9/11. Al Stein and his wife Kathy Lorentzen of Moorhead. Right there. Thank you. Marshall Moore and his wife Rosemary Wright Moore of Moorhead. Right there. Thank you for being wonderful Cobbers and continuing to support us. And my friends, Richard and Maggie Bailey, right here, and their son, Eric, who supported us in memory of Maggie's late uncle, the Reverend Tennis McGurden, who worked in Concordia's advancement office in the early 70s. And in honor of Maggie's cousin, the Reverend Tim McGordon, right there, who just retired from being a campus pastor in September. Our thanks also to the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation for freely loaning to us the wonderful Tia repriser Joe Wigand. Your partnership in this Lorentzen luncheon is greatly appreciated. Dean?
Me and my teddy bear. Thank you, Mr. President. That was an absolutely bully presentation. I've long been a fan of yours, as was my father, who had your Man in the Arena speech hanging on his wall. I will too, once I recover my possessions from Massachusetts. The next Lorentzen Luncheon will be held on October 9th and will feature Leanne Wolf, a coach at Great Outcomes Consulting, and she'll be speaking on Taoism and Tillich, working for alignment. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our sponsors who helped make this event possible. Most of all, thank you to our speaker, Teddy himself, Joe Wigand, and finally to two people without whom none of us would be here, Carol Hedberg, my special assistant, and Faith Nganjiri, the director of the Lorentzen Center for Faith and Work. I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for coming.